All right, everybody. It is Friday, October 30th, 2020, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and I want to take a second to thank you for joining me right now. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, really appreciate it. Any and all feedback is welcome. I apologize for not being around last week. Had a very special episode planned for you guys. Technical difficulties got in the way. Think we've got it all resolved now. Should look good, should sound good. If I'm not for any reason, make sure to let me know. And if you've got any questions about the business side of things or anything I cover, be sure to hit me up. I love talking about it. So again, appreciate you listening. Let's go ahead and talk about the topics we're going to cover today. So first of all, got to touch on Khabib's retirement and what that means for the UFC from a business perspective. We'll talk about UFC 254 and the pay-per-view buy rate that the Sports Business Journal reported and see how that compares to other pay-per-view buy rates we've heard and if we can trust those numbers. We'll talk about a segment I wanted to do last week where we'll see when a championship fight happens, does the business benefit from one person over the other? We won't really go into Khabib versus Gaethje, but we can cover if Bellator got the better deal of Mousasi beating Lima and some of the fights from one championship earlier this morning. We'll talk about Bellator's recent slew of signings and what's going on with them. Because if you haven't seen, they've got signings all over the place, and they've got a lot of fighters, contracted fighters that are in flux, technically not under contract right now. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll go ahead and give you a PFL update to let you know what's going on with those lawsuits or threatening of lawsuits that happened from the PFL fighters. So again, thank you for your time, and let's dive right in. All right, so first thing we've got to cover, of course, is Khabib Nurmagomedov's retirement from the sport at UFC 254. Definitely seems like it caught his coach and Dana White off guard. This was something that, he apparently had talked with his mother and said it was going to be his last fight. Talked about, his legacy with his father, obviously broke down, was very emotional. I mean, it was a huge emotional moment for him. Can only imagine what he was feeling, to go through all that without his father there when his father's been such a huge part of his life, especially in his career. So, it certainly sounded like it was a, personal pact he made with the family. There are reports coming out that Dana has talked to Khabib since then saying, oh, he was emotional, think he's going to come back and do, try and go 30-0. That's possible. I semi-believe that. However, I also think that for Khabib, it's always been about legacy. It's always been about, fighting the best of the best and making sure his legacy is complete. The one thing he asked of the UFC was to be ranked number one pound for pound in order to, hang up the gloves. That was granted to him. The rankings panel did give him that number one spot. Much to John Jones' dismay, which we won't touch on too much here, but we've touched on in other videos. But, for him, he's not the type of fighter you can lure out with money. The only way you're going to be able to lure him out of retirement is with a fight that really adds to his legacy. What options are there for him at this point, right? There's Tony Ferguson, the fight that never happened, but Tony did lose to Justin and would need at least one more win to probably get that shot. And even then, Khabib didn't seem super enthused about the idea of that. He's already beaten Dustin Poirier. He's already beaten Conor McGregor. You've got Dan Hooker, Charles Oliveira. If he goes on a crazy tear, that's someone that maybe could lure Khabib out, but I really doubt it unless he just looks phenomenal and starts, putting... If he goes out there and somehow fights McGregor or Poirier or who have you, and just looks phenomenal, maybe. But even then, it's a long shot. Pretty sure the only fight they could do at this point to draw him back out of retirement would be George St. Pierre. I can't think of another fight that would really entice him to come back out, get that 30-0, and really add to his legacy. That's definitely the biggest legacy fight for him. So that might be what Dana was talking about. This kind of got lost in the shuffle with Khabib retiring unexpectedly. But if you'll remember, Dana did say at one point, I have a surprise for him if he gets past this fight. And Khabib said, no, I want to not talk about it right now. Let me focus on this fight. We'll talk about it afterwards. And Dana said that wasn't a GSP fight. He said it was something else, something special. Well, we don't know what that was. Dana still hasn't revealed that. In the same interview with CBS Sports, where he talked about he's talked to Habib since, and that it was an emotional thing, and he thinks Habib will come out of retirement for to try and go 30-0. When asked about it, Dana said no, he hasn't talked to Habib about it. He hasn't said what that surprise was yet, so he wasn't going to tell the reporter who asked what that was, obviously. So for me, it's very hard to imagine that anything other than GSP will get him out of retirement. And I think that even though Dana's saying it's not GSP, my guess is it probably is, or it's, I don't know, maybe an inaugural 165-pound belt or a fight up at 170 against Usman. But I don't think that's really, I don't know. I don't see that really drawing him out. I think it has to be George St. Pierre. I think anything less, and Habib's going to say, no, I'm not doing that. You could, again, go into the realm of boxing and do a Mayweather match or something of that nature. That'd be pretty nuts, right? But that might entice him. Habib has talked about that in the past, about wanting to do something in that realm and getting the opportunity to do that. Again, I don't see it, but could be. Really, I think probably what is going to happen is if they can get it done, they'll do GSP versus Habib for a big pay-per-view. I don't think it'll happen in 2021. I think they'll want fans there because that's something that would probably sell out at a level of a McGregor fight in terms of getting a gate. That's huge. But then again, they have to get that fight done, right? And GSP is not minced words. He's been very good about retirement. He's one of the few fighters that has retired, and he did come back because he wanted to and have a legacy fight, but you can tell it's not about, I need to go in there and fight again. Like so many other fighters. That's what it is, right? You think about Tito Ortiz, you think about Gustafsson, you think about all these guys that say, you know what, I'm going to hang him up, and they turn around and a year or two later and say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and come back. GSP has been one of the few that really is just, no, it's about legacy for me. That's it. And, at this point, I think that's probably the only fight GSP is interested in as well. So you could get it done. You don't do it for a belt. You do it at either a catch weight or 170. I'm not really sure where you do it there, but in terms of getting that done, it's going to be hard because when the UFC can't push the lever of, hey, we're going to give you a bunch of money for this, or hey, we can give you this much money, but not that much. Those guys, GSP, and I would imagine Habib as well, are the type of guys that say, no, I need at least this much. I want to fight this person. I need this much. You don't want to do it? That's cool. I'll walk away. They're being able to walk away from those offers is massive. That's something that very few fighters either want to do or actually end up doing, right? There are a lot of fighters I imagine might say, you know what, I'm going to retire, my legacy, it's all good. And then if the UFC came back to them and said, you know what, we'll go ahead and add an extra zero onto your paycheck if you come back. There are a lot of fighters that will do that. There are a lot of fighters that will say, oh, you're going to put a zero on it? Sure. Okay, I'll come back. Habib and GSP are not those guys. So I think at this point, getting it all done, getting the money right for both fighters, getting the UFC to sign off on it, it's still a long ways away, but I think that's the only real option here. And, in terms of the segment we'll get to here in a second, last week I did preview, although you couldn't hear it because the sound was garbage, about who would be better for the UFC as a champion. Would it be Justin Gaethje or Habib? I brought up the point that for Habib, it was risky because while he's certainly gathered some of that star status, while he's really begun to get a following, especially in key markets, Russia is a market that Lawrence Epstein has said multiple times that they want to go into. The UFC wants to go into and essentially build out its brand. And Habib was a key to do that, but at the same time, I mean, in fact, that's why they did the pay-per-view at the time they did. If you're wondering why in the world did we do a pay-per-view at 2 p.m. Eastern? It's so that they could, have the Russian superstar, Dagestani superstar end up being at prime time in Russia because it's 9 p.m. in Dagestan and 10 p.m. in Moscow. Or I might have switched that around. Either way, it's, it was prime time for the Russian audience when Habib fought. And that was the whole point, was to get their superstar in that region over. It's what they've done with Weili Zhang, right? A lot of people I've talked to have said, yeah, Weili Zhang's good, but she's not a superstar or whatever. She is in China, man. She totally is. If you look at the Weibo, their social media equivalent of Twitter, if you look at when she won the belt, she was the #1 trending topic. She had all these searches. They were able to go in and renegotiate the media rights deals they had with China immediately after she won the belt. That's massive. And that's what Habib was for the UFC is, hey, here is a guy that can open up the Russian market for us. And they made moves back in 2016. There's an article on the Body Lock, one of the first ones I did for the website, talking about how they were looking to move into that market, what they were starting to build out there. Habib just accelerated that. And that was an easy win for them to say, awesome, he's champion, he's undefeated, he's this monster, he's going to be a megastar in Russia. Cool, let's roll with it. But if he won, it was always kind of a when, not if, he would retire. And that was something that I last week had brought up in the Garbled podcast, where, it's great if he wins so they can get maybe one more fight to build out the Russian audience. But he's always been okay about walking away. He's always talked about walking away when he was ready. And they don't want another GSP on their hands. And that's what they have. They now have the lightweight equivalent of GSP. That's exactly what's going on here. I mean, it's, you have a guy who at his prime, who's undefeated, which GSP wasn't even undefeated. But I mean, Habib's, finally faced elite competition. He's undefeated. He's looked like a monster. He's made some of the best guys in there look like they're not the best guys. And now he's walked away. That isn't good for business. It's not. It never is, because now let's say we do a tournament. Let's say we do McGregor versus Poirier. That fight's coming up. Let's go ahead and make it for the belt. That's great and all, but there's automatically a slight dim on that fight because everyone knows, and it will take a while before they, kind of let it settle in and kind of forget, like, oh, okay, it's been years now. Who knows if he'd still be the best? Who knows if Habib could still beat McGregor or Poirier, whoever ends up winning the belt and kind of runs with it. But for the short term, there's always going to be oh, wow, yeah, he won the belt. He's really good, but he's not as good as Habib. Habib's still the real champion. That's going to stick around for at least a year or two if Habib doesn't fight again. So, we'll see what happens with Dana saying he might come out of retirement. Again, if he does, I doubt it's for the belt. So, yeah. And it's possible, right, that you end up with, if you do a McGregor fight for the belt, which I think 100% they'll do, it's possible he wins in stunning fashion and suddenly that remembrance of Habib being the best kind of fades in the background quicker than usual. But it's not a great thing to deal with as a business, because now you have one of your most dominant champions, who was the key to an entire market, just say, you know what, I'm done. And it's going to be hard to entice those people in now. Can you? Of course. Of course you can. You just got to keep building it out other ways. But that was a fast track method that is now off the table. So overall, Habib's retirement does hurt the UFC, but good for him, right? That's great business on his end. He gets to, right now, keep an untarnished legacy. People will always put him in the GOAT conversation because, hey, that guy went 29-0 and beat all these dudes. It's one of those things where that zero next to your name when you retire is very, very rare in MMA. And doing it while you were at your peak, fighting the best competition in a stacked lightweight division in the UFC, that's, from a business perspective, that's money you can't buy. Habib will never have to worry about money. He will find seminars, he'll find appearances. He's going to be fine about money. And he doesn't care, right? We just talked about that. He doesn't really care that much. But, he has an intact legacy, and that means more to him than anything else. So I think maybe he comes back for a fight against GSP, but even then, that's not ideal for the UFC from a business perspective. So overall, awesome for Habib, not so great for the UFC. Speaking of UFC 254, let's go ahead and talk about the reported pay-per-view buys. So, according to the Sports Business Journal, UFC 254 apparently sold 675,000 pay-per-view buys total, about 500,000 US and then 175 internationally. I've seen a lot of comments on this. I've seen, oh, that means he's not as big of a star as Adesanya or Costa for drawing 800,000, or, oh man, Masvidal is more than double his numbers, all of that. Here's the truth of the matter, right? Ever since they went to ESPN Plus, behind the ESPN Plus paywall, it is much, much harder to verify numbers. And to just give you a little background about that, if you don't know, the way it used to work is, right, you could use DirecTV, you could buy it online, you could, you know, use various sources or various different channels to buy a UFC pay-per-view. In fact, right before they switched over, they even had Amazon, right? I think Cyborg versus who was it? Wasn't Nunes, but Cyborg versus somebody was on Amazon. You could buy the pay-per-view on Amazon. So you had all these different channels to where you could buy the pay-per-views. And then based on the contractual agreements, basically the UFC takes a cut of the total pay-per-view money, and then the rest is split up among the various partners. So, maybe Amazon gets a cut of, let's say, 5% because they had a 5% of the pay-per-view buys come from them. Awesome. DirecTV might get a little bit more because maybe you had 10% of the overall pay-per-views come through that channel. So because of that, what you could do is you could go to these various companies and all you needed was a couple of sources to say, hey, DirecTV, how much money did you get for these pay-per-view buys? And then go to Amazon and say, hey, how much did you get? And they would say, yeah, we got this much. It equates about 5%, or this much equates about 10%. Compare those numbers. And again, if it's 5 or 10%, and then they add up to what 100% would be, you could get a rough estimate of what the pay-per-view buys would be. So that's where you would have Dave Meltzer with his sources all over the place, right? He did it for WWE for the longest of times. He's had sources in the industry for years. He would usually be able to reach out to those sources and figure out, okay, based on what I'm hearing over at DirecTV, based on what I'm hearing over at Amazon, I'm getting a sense that this was the pay-per-view buy range. We know it's somewhere in this range. And they were generally pretty accurate. If you would look at the UFC antitrust lawsuit documents that came out where they went through financials, those numbers were pretty close. They weren't always 100%. They're never going to be. But they were pretty close. Again, because you had multiple sources that you could verify against. Now it's literally one channel. So they're getting their numbers through ESPN Plus or from Dana. Right? There is one source out there, as I've talked about multiple times, who touts these numbers and says, yep, here's the reported pay-per-view buys, who pretty much on a podcast revealed that that's the source where those numbers were coming from was just Dana telling them, which you've got to expect that to be kind of off because Dana likes to inflate things. Of course, as a promoter, you're going to, say this is amazing. Think back to the McGregor-Mayweather fight where he's like, it did this many, it was awesome. Steven Espinoza was like, I don't know what he's talking about. Here's the actual numbers. Dana has a flair for doing that type of stuff. It's good promoting, right? He said before this fight, it's tracking to be the biggest pay-per-view ever. Tracking to be bigger than McGregor versus Khabib, which, it's 2.4 million buys. That's insane. So, it's hard to trust those numbers. So when we're talking about Adesanya sold 800,000, we're talking about Masvidal sold versus Usman sold 1.3. When we're talking about, Gaethje versus Ferguson and 800,000 around there, you can't trust those numbers at face value. You just can't. They're probably inflated a little bit. How much, we won't know. Maybe they're not. It's possible that, those numbers are correct, but I would not trust those numbers at face value. Now we're talking about Sports Business Journal. It's hard to say whether or not you can trust those numbers either. Sports Business Journal, I believe has, in my opinion, is very reputable, sources their things out. The particular writer who posted this, I don't know too much about him, but the publication as a whole, I trust to do their homework and actually verify some of these things and have better sources than, say, Dana White, but I don't know. And again, because it's all coming from one company, it's very possible that the sources that he had inflated the numbers too. If it was an internal ESPN executive or Disney executive, what have you, it just makes it harder to verify if there's only one possible channel of source. Because really, you'd have to. The only way I could think of you being able to verify those numbers nowadays would be to have someone internally at the UFC, have someone at ESPN, and then have someone at Disney, and they're all, even then, it's still kind of because they're all working together, right? You know, two different companies, so with ESPN and UFC, so you could trust it a little bit more, but their partnership relies on both of them doing very well, so that's hard. And Disney versus ESPN, different companies technically, but again, all under the Disney umbrella. So I want to say these numbers are more trustworthy than the other numbers we've seen since the pandemic and since the ESPN Plus buy rate, right? Definitely want to say they're more trustworthy than the other source that's out there. But it's hard to say. Hard to say for sure how accurate they are. And if they are accurate, I know a lot of people are like, well, that's not a superstar status. It's not, in a sense, it's not, but it's not mediocre either, right? Pre ESPN Plus, you had a lot of pay-per-views doing 300,000, maybe 400,000. And then if you got past the 500,000 mark and above, you were doing well. This would qualify as that, especially with ESPN Plus, because it makes it harder to buy, right? As was pointed out about the split between US and international pay-per-views, the 175K, if that's accurate, those are much cheaper than US pay-per-views. And US pay-per-views, you have to pay $65 plus you have to pay the $5 a month for ESPN Plus. So it's really $70. So to do 500,000 behind the ESPN Plus wall is great. Is it superstar status? Nah, I mean, no. In terms of it's regional superstar status. And what I mean by that is a big pull in particular markets, definitely above your average champion or fighter. He's definitely got casual or semi-casual drawing power, but you're not at a McGregor level. You're not at a Rousey level. 675,000 behind the ESPN paywall is probably at a John Jones level, though, because what we know about John Jones pay-per-views, they were generally anywhere from 600 to 800,000. The DC rematch, I believe, was 800,000. That's kind of the John Jones level. So you're not a superstar in the sense of you are a crossover hit like Rousey or McGregor, but you are at John Jones levels. So again, if Adesanya's numbers were accurate, or let's say that they were inflated and they're closer to Khabib's, that sounds right. It sounds right that it's both Khabib and Adesanya would be that draw of not quite a mega superstar, but definitely a star within the sport, if that makes sense. So not a bad day at all for Khabib if those numbers are true, but I caution you again, don't just take the numbers at face value. There's just less sources overall to verify against. So it's important to keep that in mind. So I want to talk a little bit about Bellator again, because as I've mentioned before, in a previous episode of this podcast, Bellator has been on a tear just signing people. They've been signing UFC vets. They've been signing, bigger names, more established names for a while now. But something else of note that came out recently is that a lot of fighters are currently not under contract. Now, that doesn't mean that they are released, right? Or they're getting cut. They're just not under a contract right now. And these are some bigger names. You got Roy Nelson, you got Frank Mir, you've got AJ Agazam, you've got Chris Lencioni. You've got a lot of staples of the promotion that, Derek Campos. You've got a lot of people here that if you saw that list and you thought they were cut originally, which I know a couple people reported they were cut, but I think just the wording, it's easy to get drawn and think, oh, wow, they're all cut, but really they're not. That's still, even if they're not cut, the fact that those people aren't under contract is massive, because you never want to get to a point as a promotion where if you've got some of your bigger name stars, and they had a lot not currently under contract, the full list you can check out at Jason Floyd's Twitter. I mean, they had a lot of bigger names for Bellator that were not under contract. You never want to be negotiating all of those contracts, right? So at least a portion of those fighters are getting cut, but you don't want to also be negotiating while that many people are free agents, because back in the day, I mean, UFC would have pounced on this. They probably would have re-signed as many people as they could and just drained Bellator when they were under the model of we're trying to acquire as many names as we can. Back in the day, UFC would have gone nuts for this. They would have said, oh man, I'm picking all of these guys up. Even if they're past their prime, even if it's all this stuff, they would have signed every name fighter they could have to drain Bellator's talent pool. That's not their model anymore, so I don't expect that to happen. PFL could pounce on that. I know they've already signed a lot of fighters for next season, and because they are in that tournament format, there's only so many roster spots, so I don't foresee that happening, but they hypothetically could just sign a ton of name people right now if they made the right offers to the people that Bellator is renegotiating with and wants to bring back. If they made the right monetary offers, could take away a lot of Bellator star power and put it into PFL for 2022, or as alternates for 2021, or have them compete as PFL does, where they have the tournament bouts, but sometimes they have exhibition ones. Could start doing that too. So, it's a little bit shocking at first, but I think a big reason for all of it is it's clear to me now more than ever, especially with all of those fighters being, not under contract right now, and then the recent slew of signings that Bellator has been doing. It's clear that they're shifting the way that they bring up talent. Bellator for the longest time has been trying to promote these homegrown guys, build their own stars naturally. Aaron Pico comes to mind. You've got these guys that are young up and comers that they basically took in and groomed to end up being stars in the promotion. That's been kind of their MO, is finding the next Conor McGregor before he's even on the radar of the UFC, getting him under contract and getting him to, become a star in Bellator. Just looks so phenomenal against former UFC vets that prove, okay, like this is real competition. And getting those guys to build their own stars naturally. That's definitely been their game plan. This is a shift in all of that. This certainly seems like instead they're still doing a little bit of that, but they're really starting to look at bringing in more established names and really fill out the middle parts of the roster. And now that they have some of these names, like Chris Lencioni comes to mind, right? Like he's done very well in Bellator. He is kind of a name where you have to have watched Bellator to know who he is, but he puts on exciting fights. He's got some good trash talk. But will he rise to become a big, Bellator star? It's not really clear yet. If it is, he's still got a ways to go. It's possible that they let him go, or they basically say, hey, we'll give you this lower rate. But, they're not going to invest in those types of guys as much. It seems like instead what they're doing is they're going to keep track and hang on to the really up-and-comers that seem to be, rising their way up through the ranks, and essentially, groom those guys a little bit more. Aaron Pico, again, like take the Aaron Picos, groom them, MVP, take them, groom them, push them as stars. But they're only keeping a couple of those guys they think will really move the needle if they get to that, skill level they need to, and if they rise to the occasion as a superstar. Obviously, what Bellator is trying to do here is kind of pivot their strategy. I think a lot of this has to do with the CBS Viacom merger. I think it could be kind of an American football situation, if you know how that works, where you've got the head coach who, runs the team, but then you've got the general manager in the background saying, here's our overall strategy, here's the guys we're drafting. Could easily see that being the case. Don't forget, when Endeavor bought the UFC, there were definitely cuts within the UFC offices. Chuck Liddell and Matt Serra previously had jobs for life and then were let go due to cost-cutting measures. That type of thing with a merger where Scott Coker now reports to Steven Espinoza is totally possible. It's very possible that Showtime is the one directing this strategy to go back and, say, you know what, we actually want to have a couple of these guys we may groom into superstars, but we want more established names. We want to build out the roster a little bit more. So we'll see where this goes. We'll see what happens with that rash of fighters who are now, currently not under contract. We'll see who they retain, who they don't, whether money plays into a factor. It's very possible we may see a couple of surprising names, and then they come out in interviews later and said, yeah, they wouldn't budge on money. If they're pivoting their strategy here, because they've talked about Showtime boxing versus Bellator crossovers and things of that nature. If Showtime's calling some of these shots and they're pivoting their strategy, we may see some surprising names leave Bellator that we don't think would have left. So, and whether they go to the UFC, whether they go to PFL, who knows? But it's a shift. I think the fact that we're seeing all of these fighters not under contract, plus Bellator signing so many UFC vets or established name fighters, signals that there is an internal strategy shift here and a big pivot. And we'll see if it pays off. Will it? I can't say. Right now, I would give them a 40-60 with 60 against them pulling this off successfully. My guess is they'll need to pivot again, just because it's going to be so hard if you're to, not become that just the butt of the joke is retirement league, right? Where you've got the Frank Mears and you've got the Roy Nelsons after they're done in the UFC, they come over and it's, oh, okay. It's going to be hard to sign some of the biggest stars in their prime, because the UFC is not going to give up on that. They've kind of let their grip go of needing every ranked fighter, every name brand fighter. They've abandoned that strategy, but they haven't abandoned needing to hold the top 5, top 10 fighters in each weight class in the world. That's still crucial to their whole brand image. So it's going to be rough if they're really trying to compete on that same level. It's going to be rough. Even with the extra money from Viacom, you would need a major commitment. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. All right. So the next subject I want to get into here is what I mentioned earlier and touched on a little bit with Khabib versus Gaethje. Out of some of these more recent fights that happened yesterday and this morning, did the right guy win to help the promotion in championship fights? So Bellator 250, let's start with that one. Yeah, Douglas Lima taking on Gegard Mousasi. Mousasi was the champ, had defended it, won it from Rafael Carvalho, defended it against Rory McDonald when he tried to move up, but then lost it to Rafael Lovato Jr. Beat Lyoto Machida in a split decision that was kind of back and forth, and this was his opportunity to get another crack at the belt, because unfortunately, Rafael Lovato Jr. has called it quits and retired due to some medical issues, which is sad because I think he had a bright future, but nonetheless, you had Mousasi winning the right to challenge for that 185 strap again. Lima, on the other hand, as we know, won the welterweight tourney last year, welterweight champion, moving up to 185, trying to do what McDonald couldn't do when he was welterweight champion in capturing both of those belts against the same guy, against Gegard. So the Moose. So looking at this in terms of if you're Bellator, who you'd want to win, honestly, from a business perspective, you would want Lima to win. Mousasi was already a belt holder. The way he fights is not the most exciting, and not that that's a terrible thing, but it does play a factor. Also, Mousasi hasn't been particularly dominant, right? He lost to Lovato Jr., and it was close, but still, a lot of people thought Lovato won that fight pretty clearly. It wasn't, a robbery, so to speak. And so it's one of those things where you've just had a guy who was supposed to be this dominant force at 185. That's part of the reason you signed him, is to be the 185 champion. He came in, he defended and looked amazing against Rory McDonald, who was one of your other bigger stars. So that gives him a boost. But then he immediately drops the belt to Lovato Jr. and then goes on to win a split decision against Machida. He didn't, have some flashy knockout. He didn't look like he was dominating the whole fight. If Mousasi wins, that's not the worst thing, but it's not the best, because fans know how he's going to fight. There is some, shine taken off of him because he lost to Lovato. And again, that's nothing to knock on Lovato. Lovato was a great fighter. Again, I thought he had a bright future ahead of him, but it certainly takes away some of the aura of this dominant champion who, is, oh, he came from the UFC. He's the best of the best. It just hasn't panned out how I imagined they were hoping it would. I think Coker, when he originally signed Mousasi, was hoping, hey, here's, a guy who's been knocking people out in the UFC, right? He had that win over Chris Weidman. Took the win over Uriah Hall after taking the loss, avenged that loss. Was knocking people out, was looking like a monster, right? And left also didn't lose a couple of fights and then sign with Bellator. Was doing well in the UFC when he ended up leaving to go over there. And I think at this point, it's one of those things where they were hoping that would translate into big knockouts or exciting fights, and it just really hasn't. So they would have preferred Lima, who, looked phenomenal. Again, against Rory, that fight wasn't amazing, but in the welterweight tournament, you had that, highlight reel KO of MVP. Has just looked like a monster, a man reborn. And I think they wanted Lima to win so that you'd have, a 2-belt champion. You'd have a guy that would put on generally exciting fights. And yeah, against Rory and against Moose, he hasn't put on, the best of fights. Let's be honest. It hasn't been flashy. It hasn't been that Lima style that we love when Lima is on. But outside of those fights and against other competition, he still looked great. He still has had exciting fights. He's looked like the type of fighter where if I didn't know anything about MMA and I watched him fight, I'd be like, that's pretty awesome, right? Moose hasn't looked that way since he's come over from the UFC. Lima still has that when he's not facing some of that elite competition. And I think from a business standpoint, it would have been preferable to have Lima win. So that didn't go the way the promotion would, wanted it to, in my opinion. Now, it's not a huge lean. It's not like, man, we lost everything by Moose winning. No, of course not. But I definitely think they were, from a business perspective, kind of got the wrong person who holds the belt now, just because how do you rebuild him from here? They're going to have to do more work to rebuild Moose and really give him, quality promotion and quality fights that entice viewers to watch. So let's move on to one championship. So you had a couple of championship fights this morning. You had Thon Lee versus Martin Nguyen, and you had Ong La and Zhang and De Ritter. And so this was a mixed bag for one. I think the Lee fight is good for them. The fact that Lee won and beat Nguyen is good. And here's why. Nguyen is a powerhouse, right? He's won multiple belts, was almost a 3-belt holder in one championship. He's an exciting fighter. He's a staple. He's also been around for a while. So he's been a dominant champion. He's if he's lost a belt, he's generally won it back. Has held multiple belts at the same time in multiple weight classes, but he's been around for so long that he's at that point where, okay, he's kind of gotten the fans invested in him. Yes, we love watching him fight. If you're a one championship fan, you know who he is. Even if you're not, you've probably heard of him. But at a certain point, that dominance loses its, it has diminishing returns. Because, if I'm tuning into a Martin Nguyen fight and he keeps destroying guy after guy, that's great, but it's kind of expected. You lose that excitement. You lose this, can anyone challenge him? Unless you've got a really good contender that you can build up in the right way, you kind of just get to the point where, I expect Nguyen to run through him, or maybe it's close, but Nguyen should win this, etc. Lee beating Nguyen is great because it enables that transfer of star power. I've talked about it before. Nate Diaz was known in hardcore circles, but wasn't going on Conan O'Brien, wasn't known in the mainstream until he beat Conor McGregor. Jorge Masvidal had some star power built up from the highlight reel knockout of Askren, was well known in hardcore circles, definitely got a boost from beating Nate Diaz. That transfership of star power happens when a superstar loses to somebody else, and then that person loses to somebody else again. And even then, it still lingers, right? Like Diaz is still well known. People will still probably tune in for Diaz fights. Holly Holm is the best example for this. She keeps getting put in title fights, keeps getting put as a headliner because she still draws. If you look at the Aldana Holm ESPN views, they were still up. There were still a lot of female fighters, female fans that tuned in for Rousey, that when Rousey lost to Holm, they don't watch it unless Holm's fighting again. And they would tune in for Rousey if she came back, but that star transfers from person to person. So again, with Lee winning, that's good for one. On the other hand, you had Aung Lansang lose to De Ridder. I think that's bad for the promotion. Just because, Aung has been billed as this, dominant force, two weight class champion, has looked very good. It's been one of those things where they've kind of been building him up as one of the core superstars, right? He won not that long ago. He won the International Superstar of the Year award at the MMA World MMA Awards, right? He won that designation. He is who they tout as like, that's one of our guys. If you're talking about one of the guys who won championship, it's him. It's on. So for him to lose, that's not great. That's like the equivalent of, I'm trying to think of really honest, go back to McGregor, is when McGregor lost when he did, yes, that boosted up Nate Diaz. Yes, it gave him a rematch, but it also took away some of the shine of McGregor, and he got that back. He avenged the loss. Aung can do the same thing here, but it takes away their main star. It kind of dims a little bit of the shine. That's the case here. If Aung is unable to beat De Ridder, that really hurts them. Right now, it's not the end of the world. It's okay, he lost. It happens. It's the fight game. It's going to happen. But if he loses again, that either maybe you get a lucky break and De Ridder starts to become a bigger star, starts to become more well-known. You got kind of the passing of the torch. But more than likely, that hurts them because they're still pushing Aung as this new big superstar. He hasn't had that same type of run that feels like he's more seasoned and been around long enough where it makes sense to pass the torch. The promotion is still pushing him as this new superstar, the face of everything. So that kind of hurts. If Aung can come back and win and do it in dominant fashion, and it's all right. He's overcome adversity, get past it, similar to what McGregor did with Diaz. That's fine. If he can't, that hurts the promotion much more. So it's kind of a mixed bag for one, where the win-losing, I think, is a good thing for them. But Aung, I don't think so. I think they really would have preferred that he kept the belt and gotten more wins as champion, got more of a dominant run under him where they could milk the marketing and promotion a little bit more before having him lose. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it does make for an enticing rematch, right? But if he can't pull it off in the rematch, that's not great for the promotion on a business perspective, because you've got to then, just like Moose, you got to kind of rebuild the star a little bit, because De Ridder's been around, but he hasn't been this mega force. So yeah, mixed bag there. All right, last thing I want to cover here is PFL lawsuit update. So with what's going on in the PFL right now, obviously you had a bunch of fighters say, you know what, we want out of our contracts. We're threatening a lawsuit on Twitter. It's kind of a thing. PFL has now announced that the new season, the 2021 season, starts in April. They've given a set date. This is a good move by the PFL, because what it does is it kind of puts a time limit on those fighters to make a move. As I said in my last video, if PFL doesn't end up, or I'm sorry, if the fighters don't end up, suing here, then, it's kind of, they were bluffing. They were essentially saying like, hey, you better give us more money, or hey, you better let us out of our contract so we can fight in other places. But if they don't actually follow through with the lawsuit, then it's just all, we're angry, we're threatening it, but we're not going to do anything. Okay, that's fine. But that threat, taking that to Twitter, is unusual. If you're going to actually file a lawsuit, you normally don't take to Twitter to say like, hey, we're going to do this, and give the other party a heads up, right? In Canelo's suit against DAZN and Golden Boy, he didn't say, hey, like, you've got to let me out or I'm going to file a lawsuit on Twitter. That wasn't a thing. Or if it was, I completely missed it, but pretty sure it wasn't a thing. You generally don't give the other party a heads up. That's just kind of showing your hand. So PFL is kind of calling their bluff here. They're essentially saying, look, here's a set date. You have until April to make a move on this. Because are you going to come back in April and fight for us? Because then you'll get your money. Then you have your shot at $1 million. Or are you going to try and file a lawsuit in between? And if they file a lawsuit, then it becomes a matter of, can they get pulled from the tournament? We're talking about independent contractors here, right? Depending on the way these contracts are written, it's very possible that if they're in litigation, which would, I'm assuming, go longer than 6 months because almost all litigation does. If they're in litigation here, it's very possible that they could say, all right, we're pulling you from the tournament and we're going to replace you with other people. As I mentioned earlier, Bellator's got a bunch of fighters not under contract. PFL could, go ahead and scoop up. I think they've already, in the same batch of fighters that they signed with Shayman Moraes and others, I think they've already kind of shored up that hole, so to speak, to say, okay, we can just insert these guys if you guys don't want to fight. And that puts people like Lance Palmer and Brandon Loughlin in kind of a bind, because now you've got to make a choice. You've got to either go for litigation quickly and then try and get something moving before this all starts, or you've got to just acquiesce and say, all right, well, now I got 6 months. I've got to start a camp, right? In 4 or 5 months. I've got to start a camp for this next fight. Do you really want to deal with a lawsuit while doing all of that? Now, also, depending on how the contract's written, it's very possible that the lawsuit happens while they are still under contract with PFL and they still compete. There's instances of that. Say Mark Hunt in the UFC. He was going through litigation the whole time while still fighting under the promotional banner. Could very well happen in PFL too. But again, being independent contractors, as someone who has been an independent contractor through a lot of my, career, for most of my career, there are ways and there are things written in contracts that, yes, you can file for breach of contract, or you can file for certain, clauses not being adhered to and vice versa. But there are a lot of ways that they can basically say, no, we're just going to cut ties. And that becomes kind of a big question on the fighters' minds who are threatening this lawsuit is, do I really want to move forward with that and possibly get cut when I could hypothetically win $1 million in 8 months, right? That becomes a whole situation for them. So I think it was a really good move on PFL's part to essentially say, you know what, we're going to announce the season. We're going to move it up a little bit to April, but we're going to announce it now so that they kind of start the clock. Because if the fighters wait until right before, the tournament, well, they can do that, but who knows what happens there. It's also possible, again, depending on how everything is written, very possible that if they try and file the litigation beforehand and it's not resolved, or it does get resolved, right? Let's say they get resolved very quickly where nope, gets dismissed. I doubt they would do summary judgment that fast. But so my guess would be a dismissal, a quick dismissal. It's very possible that then they just say, okay, cool, we're done. We're releasing you. Because that's how things work. That's how independent contractor relationships work. You don't have those protections as an employee in a lot of cases where you can say, all right, I'm filing a lawsuit against you because I believe you've done something wrong and you can't fire me. Otherwise, I'll file another lawsuit. Nope, that's not how it works. So all comes down to the contracts. It definitely puts, the clock on the fighters, because if you're going to go through a camp, going to try and do all this, that's a giant headache. I can't even imagine how busy you would be and trying to be stressed and thinking about that, distractions. Oof, no thanks. So good call on PFL here. They're sort of calling the fighters bluffs. Fighters either need to make a move now, file that lawsuit in the next week or two, really push things up, or they need to just kind of say, all right, bluff called and we'll be a part of the tournament. And I'm sure we'll hear about complaints. I'm sure that after this year, 2021, there'll probably be some people that if their contracts are up, they won't resign with the PFL, or if they're not up, they might try and negotiate to get out of contracts, depending on how that all works. But I mean, it's a smart move by the organization here to force the fighters to make a move quickly, put some pressure on them, shift it back to them, so to speak. All right, guys. Well, that's all I've got for today. Again, thank you so much for listening. Again, appreciate the patience with waiting for another podcast. Shouldn't have any more technical difficulties. Should only go up from here. Make sure you like and subscribe. Got any questions? Please hit me up. Really appreciate it. And I'll catch you next time. Get that money.